So in this recording, I'm going to speak about Anselm's ontological argument in his Proslogion, and specifically I'll focus on chapter 2. So the Proslogion begins with chapter 1, in which Anselm is seeking God, and he's praying to God, and he's seeking God, and so praying about trying to find God. And then he begins chapter 2 with the claim about God. So he's still in this mode of prayer. And he begins with the claim that says that now we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. So we'll say we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. All right, so I think the first step is to try to understand this statement, because this is essentially what the argument depends on, understanding this particular statement. Now, so I could try to draw this out to see if this makes sense. All right, so the way I like to think about this is, so I'm going to say, it says, so we believe, right? So let's just note that, again, this is a statement of belief. It's not derived. It's simply what he believes. And so he's praying to God, and he says, God, that you, okay, you are something. Okay, so this something here, I'm just going to put an arrow here. And so let's put an X in square brackets. Okay, so you are something, that's this, than which nothing greater can be thought, right? So I like to think of it this way. I'm just going to put like a Y here in square brackets, okay? And this definition seems to be saying something like this, that, okay, we believe, God, that you are something, that's this, right? Something than which nothing greater can be thought. So saying you think of God and think of anything else, right? Whatever you think of is always going to fall short of God. Okay? So it can never ever attain to God, whatever you think of. Right. So this claim is some of a comparative claim, right? It's making the claim that God, you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. So there's nothing greater, okay, than this thing, God. Okay, so let us just make a note here, right, that this statement, okay, is not necessarily saying that God, okay, is the greatest thing. Okay, so yeah, he does he does make the point later in the Proslogion that he does demonstrate to his satisfaction that God is in fact the greatest thing. But for this chapter, that's not what he's saying. He's saying that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought, right? That means you think about God and think about anything else, anything possible, anything else you can possibly think of, and it's never going to be greater than God, right? So that is how I would say to understand that statement. Now, so how does he set this up? So he starts that's the first step to make this claim about God being something than which nothing greater can be thought. And then he immediately brings up the opposing view, right? And he raises the question if it's possible to actually think, is it possible that there is no such being? All right, so I'm just going to draw a line here. And so on this side here, we will talk about what Anselm calls, well, the person Anselm calls the fool. All right, so Anselm says, he talks about the person he calls the fool, and he's quoting from the Bible. He says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." All right, so just to be clear, Anselm is not necessarily calling anyone who doesn't believe in God a fool, but he's quoting from the Bible, and so the fool becomes the representative of anyone who makes a claim there is no God. So let's see what Anselm says here. He says, "So can it be that no such being exists, since the fool has said in his heart, there is no God? But when this same fool hears me say something than which nothing greater can be thought, he surely understands what he hears, and what he understands exists in his understanding." All right, so when the fool hears a statement that we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought, okay, the fool understands the statement, okay, and this implies that the statement exists in the fool's understanding. All right. So what claim is he making here, or how should we understand this? Now, he's saying if the fool understands, I think the fool understands the statement, so we should see what he means by, to understand. So for Anselm, to understand is essentially saying that the statement exists in one's mind. And another way of thinking of this is that to understand means the statement is understandable. All right, so what am I getting at with this idea of saying the statement is understandable? And that's the idea that essentially statement is logically coherent. It checks the boxes logically. Okay, something than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay, so if, let's say for instance, you had a concept like square, circle. The individual words make sense. Okay, so but this concept is not understandable, right? That's because it is not logically coherent, right? So square and circle make sense. You can join together and say square circle, but it's not an understandable concept. Like you cannot rigorously examine it as a logical coherent concept because it just isn't, right? Doesn't make sense. So something like this square circle cannot exist in your understanding, right? It's not an understandable concept. Okay, so that's key here because if this statement, something than which nothing greater can be thought, exists, the fool understands that means it exists in his understanding, and it's an understandable statement. That means it's logically coherent. All right, so then he goes on with the argument. He says, but when the same fool hears me say something than which nothing greater can be thought, he surely understands what he hears, and what he understands exists in his understanding, even if he does not understand that it exists in reality. All right, so it's not important at this point that the fool is saying, yeah, it's logically coherent, it's understandable, but I still don't believe that exists, right? That doesn't matter at this point. It just, as long as he grants that it's logically coherent, it can exist in the understanding, that's enough for Anselm. Then Anselm says it's one thing for an object to exist in the understanding, another to understand that the object exists in reality. Okay, to exist in the mind and to exist in reality are two distinct things, Right. So this is what Anselm making the case that something can exist in the mind and not exist in reality, but it does exist in the mind. Okay. Um, Now, but whatever exists in reality has to be able to exist in the mind, right? That means so that's one distinction between the two. But Anselm is making the point that to exist in the that two separate ways of existing here: to exist in the mind and then to exist in reality. And then he comes to the example of uh, a painter. So he uses the painter example. So he says about the painter. When a painter, for example, thinks out in advance what he is going to paint, he has it in his understanding, but he does not yet understand that it exists since he has not yet painted it. So the painter example is that the painter thinks out in advance, right? So again, this is just to support this idea that um, for something to exist in the mind, it's not simply that someone raises an idea and it just sticks in there, right? That means he's talking about something deeper cognitive commitment. So when he says the painter thinks out in advance, that means so as the painter is working on painting something, right? She spends a lot of time thinking about the form, about the colors, about the proportions, and she's working out a lot of things in her mind, right? So in this case, it's equivalent of working out all the logical inconsistencies. Once a painter does that, right, you can say the painting exists in the mind, but the painter understands that painting doesn't exist in reality. Okay, so at this stage, painting is understood as existing in the mind. Okay, but not understood as existing in reality. Okay, however, once it is painted, so when painted, it now exists both in reality and in the mind. All right, so there's two things that we can get from this example. Right, so let's put this here. So two things from painter example. Right, so the first thing is that if something can exist in the mind, then it is possible to exist. Just move this down. Okay, so if something can exist in the mind, then it's possible to exist. That means, so if it's, again, to exist in mind is that it's logically coherent, right? And it's an understandable statement. Now, the second thing is that, so there are two ways or tiers of existing. Okay, and one is in the mind. Oops. And the other is in reality, right? So there are two ways. So from this painter example, he's trying to establish two things: that if something can exist in the mind, then it's possible for it to exist. Right. The second one is that there are two ways or tiers of existing in the mind and in reality. All right. So if we return to the fool, let's see what Anselm then has to say. So he said, so even the fool must admit that something than which nothing greater can be thought exists at least in the understanding, since he understands this when he hears it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. Okay, so this is his restating what we've said here. The fool accepts this statement, says it's logically coherent. I agree, it makes sense, right? And so he's granting this. And surely So he goes on to say, and surely that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist only in the understanding. For if it exists only in the understanding, it cannot be thought to exist. For if it exists only in the understanding, it can be thought to exist in reality as well, which is greater. All right, so here there is an assumption here that is important, which is this, that to exist in reality, okay, is greater than to exist only in the mind. Okay, and I think instinctively this makes sense to us, but this is Anselm's basic, this is an assumption he's making here, right? And it's a very reasonable one, right? To exist in reality is greater than to exist only in the mind, right? So keeping this in mind, now Anselm is saying that if the fool accepts the above claim, right, that God is something than which, okay, then the fool essentially is accepting that the claim is only logically coherent, okay, if such a being exists in reality. So why is that? Because he's saying, well, to exist in reality is greater than to exist only in the mind, right? And if we're saying that it's a logical claim, right? It makes sense to say that there is something than which nothing greater can be thought, right? So that's a claim, right? The claim is that there is something than which nothing greater can be thought. So if that claim is logically coherent, right, then if this being only exists in the mind, then it wouldn't be that than which nothing greater can be thought, right? Because you can conceive of that being that only exists in the mind plus it existing, right? So this particular thing cannot only exist in the mind. It has to exist both in the mind and in reality. Otherwise, it wouldn't be that than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay, so I will just go ahead and write that. So this kind of being cannot only exist in the mind. Otherwise, it would not be that than which nothing greater can be thought. So the way Anselm's argument is working is that if the fool is willing to grant this as a logically coherent statement that can be understood, right, then for this particular kind of being, it flows that it has to exist, and he explains why, right, and going through all of this. The key thing to note is that this argument is not going to work for anything else. So it's not going to work for thinking about a house or an island or a horse, right? So you can't say we believe that there's a horse than which no greater horse can be thought, right? Because a horse is a defined thing. This is something special. This has to be a very unique thing, something that is at the intersection of possibility and necessity, right? So he's saying that this argument applies specifically to this thing here, that is something than which nothing greater can be thought.